Okay. Good afternoon. My name is Leo Casey. I am Executive Director of the Albert Shanker Institute, which, together with the American Federation of Teachers, is sponsoring this afternoon's forum. It is the first of a series of forums that we will be doing throughout this academic year. The second Wednesday of every month, we will have a different forum. The topics that we are working on right now are listed on the handout that you picked up on your way in. But I will tell you that the next one, which will be October 9th, will be held in the AFT building right near Capitol Hill. And it will be on the topic of civic purposes of education and the Common Core. And we have 4 people confirmed with a possible mystery guest if we get a 5th confirmation. And those 4 people are Chester Finn from Fordham, Kathy Swan, who was the lead author of the C3 Common Core standards, Russ Weiner from the Aspen Institute, and some guy named Leo Casey.
Is that the mystery guest?
And the other thing I want to tell you, just as a housekeeping matter once we get started, is that the different presenters would like to see each other's presentations, and the only way they're going to be able to do that is to sit in the audience. So when they all get up and leave, it's not because they're storming out on each other, it's because they're actually moving to a place where they will be able to see the presentations. With that, I would like to introduce our moderator for the forum today. She is Randi Weingarten, who is president of the American Federation of Teachers and of the Albert Shanker Institute, and was once my co-teacher in a classroom in Crown Heights, Brooklyn. Randi?
What he doesn't tell you was he was my mentor, and that I would never have been a successful classroom teacher, high school classroom teacher, but for Leo Casey. And we had a very good time teaching the AP government class and the We the People competition. But he is one of the finest secondary school teachers I know in the country, and I know many, many fine ones, and Leo was one of the finest. I do want to do a couple of things very quickly. Number one, it is 9/11, 12 years after what happened both in Pennsylvania and New York City and in Washington, D.C. And I don't think that today should go without just noting that 9/11 is pretty important both in Chilean history as well as in American history. And so I just want to honor all of those fighters for justice and for freedom and democracy. Number two, I want to thank the staff of the, you can't hear me? Is that better? I've had my coffee now. I want to thank the Leo Casey, who is the not so new director anymore of the Shanker Institute, and the Shanker Institute staff for the planning of this really important forum. And also to say that this is going to become one of a series of the kind of conversations that ought to be happening in Washington in terms of how to really look at educational policy from, frankly, lots of different views, but from the vantage point of a progressive viewpoint about education and what is actually really happening bottom up, as opposed to simply what I've seen, and excuse me for saying it, more and more and more of a disconnect between where the policymakers are and where schools actually are. And so that's what Leo and the Shanker Institute and ultimately AFT is trying to do with these series, and I'm just really very, very, very excited that Shanker has conceived in the true way that Al Shanker would have wanted to do this kind of series going forward. What I get to do is to introduce our speakers and to tell you that each of them will speak for pretty much around 10 to 15 minutes. And after they speak, they have already been told that I will ask them a couple of questions that they know so that they've prepared the answers to those questions as well. I'm not going to tell you the questions yet because you'll have to stay awake and listen to the speakers who, frankly, actually know more about this subject from all sides than pretty much anyone else I know. And the subject, as you know, is the use of value-added and other test-based measures of performance in teacher evaluation. And I think that what you'll hear shortly is not what people were saying about value-add a year or two ago, but really what is going on right now and whether or not this methodology is ready for prime time, or whether it should be jettisoned, or whether it should be, changed or whatnot. But that's really the conversation that's about to happen. So the first speaker is my colleague to the left and a dear friend.
That's the order.
Oh, I'm sorry. Excuse me. Ixnay on the first speaker that way. The first speaker is my colleague to the right, who I have not known as long as I've known Leo and Linda, and that's Doug Harris, who is the Associate Professor of Economics and Endowed Chair of Public Education at Tulane University, and the Director of the New Orleans Education Research Alliance, and has done, as many of you know, a very extensive review of value add in his book, Value-Added Measures in Education. I can tell you a bunch of other things about Doug as well, but let me just simply say he's one of the top 10 most influential economists studying education. After Doug will be Tom. I got this right now? And Tom Kane is on the panel, he is to my far left. And I won't go further than that. And Tom is also someone who is very well-versed in both education and economics. He's a professor of education and economics at Harvard Graduate School of Education. He is the faculty director of Harvard Center for Education Policy Research. He has been, as many of you know, the deputy director in the K-12 team of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundations, and he is basically, in my judgment, the kind of intellectual gravitas of the Gates Foundation's measures of effective teaching. His work has influenced many, many, many people over the course of time, and I am delighted that he is on this panel and will be speaking about his current views of value add. And the last person that I want to introduce is the person I was going to introduce at first and who will be speaking last as opposed to first. And that is Linda Darling-Hammond, who is the Charles E. Dukeman, is that how you pronounce it? Thank you. Professor of Education at Stanford. She's also the co-director of the Stanford Center for Opportunity Policy in Education. And as many of you know, just like with Doug and with Tom, Linda has served in many, many different positions, including as the policy director for the Obama campaign in 2007 and 2008, and many other committees and commissions, and done much writing on how you really ensure equity and professionalism in public K-12 education. And with that, I'll turn it over to Doug.
Is this where the mass exodus begins?
You can use that, yes. And there's your.
All right, thanks very much, Randy and everyone. It's great to be on this illustrious panel. It really is quite a group we have here. It strikes me coming to a conversation like this that we've only really been having the conversation about value added for maybe 5 years. And most things in education you can go back and read a history book about, the curriculum and testing and textbooks, all these things go back a very long way. Value added is something that just sort of popped on the screen. Researchers have been talking about it, people in Tennessee knew about it, but for the most part the national conversation was not there. And then suddenly, partly as a result of some of Tom's early work and Rick Hanishek's and others, the value-added measures started to draw a lot more attention, and that then precipitated the conversation about teacher evaluation. And I think the value-added measures are important in part, and maybe even mainly, because they've created this conversation and created this debate and now created a whole new set of policies around teacher performance and teacher evaluation that we probably wouldn't have had otherwise. Like, I don't think if the value-added measures hadn't come, I don't think any of these policies would have come into being. And so I think that's probably the most important thing that they've accomplished. But now we're here, we have to figure out what to do with them, right? And that's what the debate has been about. So what I'm going to do is two things. One is to try to put a little precision on what the positions might be on value added, especially in terms of the level of stakes we might attach to them. And then I was asked to talk about a proposal I put forward, a different way of using value added measures other than the ways in which districts and states are currently using them. So that's what I'm going to do. So the first way to think about this, the formatting got all messed up here, but basically the idea here is you have a continuum from low to high on the amount of stakes that we get attached to value added. And I'm going to go through 5 different possibilities. These are not exhaustive. You could come up with a different way of creating these categories. And then I'm going to talk in particular about the one that I was asked to talk about. So the first position you could take, lowest stakes possible, would be no value added at all. Forget about it. We're not going to, no value add. We're not going to go there. This position tends to come from those who are generally opposed to high stakes testing. And so this is going to come back later in the panel discussion when we talk about the E.D. Hirsch piece that was written recently. The second position would be, with a little bit more aggressive use, would be just use it for identifying patterns of performance, the role of experience, the effects of different kinds of professional development programs, but not to hold any individual teacher accountable for performance. Now the third one is the one that I'm going to talk about. That's the quote-unquote new option. So we're going to leave that. That one I'm going to put in the middle of all these. The number 4 option is really what the race to the top states are doing. This is where teacher value added is going to be one of the factors associated or part of the performance measure, but not the only one. That it's clearly part of multiple measures. It's not the primary measure, but it's playing a role in high stakes employment decisions. And then the 5th and most aggressive would be that value added should be the primary measure. Now, very few people take this 5th position, but it is suggested sometimes. When we see studies talking about what would happen if we fired a certain X percentage of teachers, of the lowest value-added teachers, that doesn't explicitly state that we should have such a policy where that's the only measure, but it's sort of suggested by the way in which the analysis is taking place. So we don't hear that one very often. But I think this sort of encapsulates the range of positions that we could have here. There's a lot of nuance that's missing in that categorization, but I think this helps frame the discussion, and maybe Linda and Tom can think about their positions in terms of this. We can have a concrete conversation about how our positions might differ. The nuances that are missing here are things like, well, are we using value added only to evaluate teams of teachers versus individual teachers? Are we trying to evaluate all teachers with value added, or only those in traditionally tested grades and subjects? Things like that. So there are lots of nuances here, but I still think we're capturing the main piece with that first continuum. All right, and I already talked about, one other interesting point here too is in these conversations on value added, it strikes me, I'm often on these sort of pro-con panels, and it strikes me that oftentimes the supporters of value added usually will start off by saying, it's really important that we have better measures, that teachers are really important, and that value added can be a really important part, but there are these problems, there are these caveats, and so we shouldn't use it as the only measure. Opponents will start at the other end and say, well, look at all these problems. This is terrible. We can't possibly think about using this for teacher evaluation. But then say, well, but it might be useful as one part of multiple measures, right? So the positions in the end up being not very different. The tone of the conversation is quite different, and the way in which the arguments get made are quite different. But there isn't that much disagreement about the facts, and I think even on the bottom line, there doesn't seem to be that much difference in terms of at least the researchers who are working on this in terms of where they come down on using it. All right, so let me come back now to number 3. What's this alternative way of thinking about value added? Well, the first thing to think about here is kind of how we got where we are and where we are right now with value added. So right now, the race to the top has sort of nudged districts and states into a particular policy direction. That is to take value added, take a classroom observation, maybe take some other things, and lump it all together into a weighted average measure of teacher performance, and then make high-stakes decisions based on that composite measure. Why are we doing this? Partly because the race to the top policy was kind of vague. It said student achievement has to be a significant factor in the determination of teacher performance. Now, if you're a state or a district and you're trying to get a competitive grant, you're going to try to meet that requirement as clearly as possible. What's the simplest thing to do? Create a composite measure and assign a number to it. Right? If you want to say something's a significant factor, assign a number to it. Really, the only way to do that is with a composite measure. So that naturally nudged districts and states in that direction. It was also probably the most intuitive and the first thing that a district might think about, or a state might think about in applying for these things, because we do this all the time, right? We have consumers' reports that takes different parts of cars and refrigerators and create an overall quality measure. We have heat indexes that take temperature, combine it with humidity. Believe me, in New Orleans, the heat index matters a lot. We have, if you follow football at all, college football has these, the BCS rankings that take all sorts of different things, lump it together into some index, and then that's where the rankings of the colleges come from. So it's an intuitive thing to do. But it's not necessarily the best thing to do. One problem with it is cost, right? So if you're going to do that, you have to collect all the information on all the teachers. Right, that's expensive, right? To do these classroom observations and to do them well, part of this is what came out of the MET project, that even classroom observations can be unreliable. So if you're going to do this, if you're going to observe every teacher and you're going to do it 5 times a year, that takes resources. It takes the time of administrators, teachers, and others involved. And they're already struggling, financially struggling and struggling with the time that they have now. So that's something that we have to pay attention to. The unintended consequence of getting states or inducing states to now try to test in every grade and subject. If we're going to be fair about it, and we think by fairness we mean we're going to apply the same framework to every teacher, then that means we have to collect the same information for every teacher. That means we have to expand testing to every grade and subject. So states like Florida, this is what they're doing. They're going to just test everything. We're going to go down to kindergarten. We're going to test that. We're going to test art. We're going to test music. Just test it all. Then you can come up with a value-added measure. Okay. I don't think most people think that's a great idea, but that's one response if you want to be fair about it. Validity. So one problem with value added in general, and the focus on high stakes testing in general, is the negative form of teaching to the test. And so I'm distinguishing this from aligning the curriculum, because some people would say teaching to the test is good to the degree it aligns teaching with the curriculum. Okay, we'll leave that aside, but there are all sorts of bad forms of teaching to the test that are very prevalent. So there are lots of reasons why we might be concerned about doing it this way. So what's the new option? So the new option is what I call a screening approach, and this involves 2 different steps. One is to take value-added measures in a first stage of a 2-step process, in which the first stage is taking less quality, less clear information, and making a determination about which teachers you need to collect more information on. Right? So you'd use the value-added measure plus a little bit of other information to decide, all right, these teachers are sort of on the margin of whatever decision we're trying to make, whether it's at the low end, trying to make a tenure decision, or at the high end, trying to decide who's going to get performance pay. You would decide based on that initial cut who you need to collect more information on. Then in the second stage, you would get higher quality information on those teachers who are on the margin. So that's the first part of the screening. So I use the word screening because what's happening is you're using this first stage to screen teachers, put them in categories for the second stage. Second problem is trying to find some way to improve the classroom observation. So I think there's pretty wide agreement now that the classroom observation is really going to be the heart and should be the heart of teacher performance measurement and accountability. So if that's the case, we need some way to make sure validity on those is high. And there are all sorts of things that can go wrong there as well, right? We can have observers who are not very well trained. We can have personal biases come into play. If it's somebody in the school who knows the teacher, you can worry about personality biases. I've talked to principals about how they hire teachers, and they'll often say, well, you know, I didn't like this teacher because I know this teacher had a good relationship with the previous principal, and I didn't like the previous principal. So, I mean, you can see all these different personal issues get involved, and it's not just schools that have this problem. This happens in any organization. So we want to have some way of trying to prevent that and to improve the classroom observations as well. And so you can use the value-added measure for this as well, because one thing we've seen clearly in the research is that there tends to be a correlation within a certain range between the value-added measure and the classroom observation. And so if you saw a really high correlation, you'd probably be worried that people are going into the classroom knowing what the value-added score is and just creating a classroom observation that happens to align with what the observer already knows about value-added. On the low end, you might be worried if all these personality issues are coming into play that there might be no correlation or a negative correlation, and that would just be a flag. It wouldn't be determinative. You wouldn't fire the observer if the correlation wasn't right, but it would be a flag where you could go and collect other information, maybe provide other training to the observers, go in and at least check what's going on. So the idea here is both to improve the data collection, the direct data collection for the teachers, and simultaneously to improve the classroom observations using value added. So part of the analogy here comes from healthcare. So one thing that happens commonly in healthcare is that we have a screening test. You go in, if you're gonna test for some disease, they will often give what's called the screening test first. It's a test that will capture everybody who might have the disease, but will screen out a lot of people who don't. And then in the second stage, then they have a second test, which would be the gold standard test, which has nearly 100% accuracy. That one's much more expensive, right? So you wouldn't want to give the gold standard test to everybody because it just costs too much. So you can see where the analogy is coming from here, right? Just a lot cheaper to do it this way. It's more efficient to collect the information this way than to apply the best information you possibly can to everybody equally. It's just not very efficient. All right, now some would call this a triage approach. It's something like triage, but I think screening is a better term for this. All right, so what are the advantages here? Cost is one obvious advantage. So it's going to be cheaper because you're going to focus your data collection efforts on those teachers who you have good reason to think are on that performance margin. Could increase validity by increasing the quality of the classroom observations, could reduce the negative form of teaching to the test, because now the final, so one thing that should be clear now is the final decision doesn't get made based on value added anymore, if value added is only in the screening stage. All the value added is doing directly then is guiding the information collection. It's not actually part of the final decision anymore. So there's less of an incentive to game the system to teach to the test in harmful ways. It's fairness because you no longer have to have the high-stakes test in every grade and subject. You don't have to have it in music and art, and yet you're still applying the same process because the value added wouldn't be the only part of the screening process. So, and the final decisions then would be made the same way for everybody based on the classroom observation. So it's also fairer than what we're doing now, at least fairer in the sense that if we don't also have to go get all these additional tests. Okay, so those are the advantages. There are some more ambiguous properties. What it would do to reliability is a little bit unclear. If it does improve the classroom observations, it could improve reliability in that sense. On the other hand, combining measures together, again, as the Met study shows, can increase reliability. So it's not entirely clear what the net effect is there. All right. So one important thing to point out here is that this process, this alternative way of doing it, would only make sense with certain combinations of measures. So I've been talking about the classroom observation and the value-added measures being the two. Both of those focus on classroom instruction. That's the intent is to measure the quality of classroom instruction in very different ways. If you were using, say, an informal rubric from the principal that might include things like what the teacher contributes to the school community and other things that are distinct from classroom observation, this might not make a lot of sense. You wouldn't use a screening device based on value added to then decide whether you're going to collect information on whether teachers are contributing to the school community. That wouldn't make a lot of sense. It only works if both of the measures you're working with are measuring the same general thing. So why aren't districts and states doing this? I think, again, part of the reason is race to the top. I've talked to districts about it. They say, we'd love to do this, except our state says no. We're a race to the top state. It says we can't do it. So they're a bit stuck right now. I don't think the department has a clear position on whether something like this would count achievement as a significant factor or not. I'm also writing a policy brief, a longer version of this, that's going to come out from the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching, I think next month. So you'll be able to get more details from that. But I think the larger point, right, so I was asked to talk about this specific plan. The larger point here is that we need to have a broader range of experimentation. We don't know a lot about the best way to use multiple measures. What we do know is that most places are doing pretty much the same thing, and yet they would want to be trying different things. And so I think we need to recognize the box that we've been put into, the box really that practitioners have been put into, and the possibility of doing a broader range of things and trying new things, and then collecting evidence on it. So like I said at the beginning, we've only been in this for 5 years. We know very little about the effectiveness of using value added for high stakes in general, and we know even less about how different practices might work because we haven't really been trying a very broad range of practices. So I think that's the main message. I'm not trying to sell this, make a hard sell on this idea, but I think it's a useful one for showing how we might go about this in a different way. So thank you.
Thanks, Doug. I found your motivation at the beginning particularly refreshing because I and you and Linda have been on a bunch of these kinds of panels in the last couple years where two sides that were supposedly disagreeing ended up actually being there being more consensus than it appeared at the beginning. So I actually think that if you polled most of the experts in this field, you would find consensus in that somewhere between 20 and 50% of the weight in teacher evaluations could and should be placed on student achievement measures. Now, that's not, though, the way that the issue often gets framed. So I'm actually going to try to do a little bit of a reframing here. Instead, rather than saying, okay, let's have a debate about whether it should be 0 or 100, I'm instead going to say, all right, what would you have to believe in order to argue that student achievement gains should play no role? And let's assess the evidence on whether or not those beliefs seem to hold any water. Because I think rather than having more debates that seem to be arguing whether or not we should be including value added, rather we should be arguing about how it should be used, as Doug was suggesting, and how the other parts of the evaluation process, namely the classroom observation and potentially the student survey, could be improved. So let's see if I can, my goal then is to try to shut down the old debate and move on to the new. So if I were trying to make the case for 0 weight, what would I argue? Well, first thing is I would try to say, okay, value added in any given year provides no information about future years. Because if it did provide some information about future years, that would argue for including it in some kind of measure. So what's the evidence for the claim that you have to believe that value added provides no information about a teacher's student achievement gains in future years? Well, one way to do that is to do a little thought experiment where you say, what proportion of those teachers who are in the bottom decile in terms of value added in 1 year were in the bottom or top quartile over their career? And over their career, this is literally in 3 different districts we could identify measure value added in 6 or more years. So there are a few districts that had data that would allow you to calculate value added over multiple years. And so we could just do the calculation, not a simulation, these are real data, where we could say, okay, suppose you just used 1 year of data, identified the teachers who are in the bottom decile in terms of value added in that 1 year, and then look at their average value added over their career and see, what was the relationship. Well, these are from 3 different districts. The first 3 columns are in math. The second 3 columns are in English language arts. So of those who are in the bottom 10%, 67% in District 1 were in the bottom quartile over their career. 81% in District 2 were in the bottom quartile over their career. 70% in 3. A little bit lower in ELA in Districts 1, 2, 3. Now, what proportion were in the top quartile over their career? Well, not 0, so it's not that value added in a given year is a perfect predictor of the career, but only 3% of those who are in the bottom decile 1 year were in the top quartile over their career. If there were no information in the single year of value added, you'd expect to see 25% there. So that's obviously much lower than 25%. So it is demonstrably not true that value added in a given year provides no information about a career. That should be the test for the argument that this is all just statistical noise. A second argument one would have to make is okay, value added is bias due to unmeasured student traits. Well, again, that's possible that value added is so biased that it provides no information. But again, what would you do if you actually seriously wanted to test that hypothesis? Well, you'd say, okay, if we randomly assign teachers to classroom, would their prior value-added scores predict how well their students performed after random assignment? That's the way you test whether or not the value-added measures are so hopelessly biased that they don't provide you with any information about the causal effect of a teacher. So if we were serious about that claim that value-added measures are entirely biased, we'd actually do the test. Well, we did do that in the Measures of Effective Teaching project. In the second year, we randomly assigned classrooms, and the goal was to see whether the measures that we collected the first year had any predictive power, because that's the only way to test the bias. Well, what did we find? Well, these are breaking the MET sample into 20 different groups. Along the x-axis is their predicted effectiveness. On the y-axis is the actual achievement following random assignment. So this is using a value-added measure to predict how well a teacher's students would do following a random assignment, and then just checking to see whether that prediction ended up working. And the dotted line is just the line where actual would equal predicted. So it's not the fitted line, although it turns out that it would be the fitted line, that the actual achievement following random assignment, on average, matched pretty well with the predicted achievement. Okay, what would be the third argument you'd make if you were trying to argue for zero weight? Well, you'd say, okay, value added is completely unrelated to what experts consider to be excellent instruction. Well, what's the evidence on that? So what would you do? What thought experiment would you run if you were interested in that question? Well, the first thing you'd do is you'd say, suppose we scored a bunch of teacher videos on a number of different rubrics and made sure that the observers who were observing them didn't know what those teachers' value-added scores were. So let's make sure that the observers had no idea what the student achievement gains were in that classroom, and let's have them apply a number of different rubrics to watch the videos, and let's see how the scores were related to the value-added scores. Because, again, let's test the proposition that this has nothing to do with excellent instruction. Well, what do you find? Well, on the state math tests, using 4 different rubrics, the MQI, the UTeach, Teacher Observation Protocol, class, framework for teaching, there's a positive relationship between the scores people got on the classroom observations and their value-added score. It's not perfect, there's not 100% correlation, but again, In order to argue that they should play no role whatsoever, you'd have to say it has no relationship to a teacher's student achievement gains. And that again, that's clearly not true here. Now, one thing I would call out is in the bottom two panels is that there is a stronger relationship between classroom observations and student achievement measured in a literacy test that required kids to do some writing. So the Stanford 9 open-ended reading test was a reading comprehension test that required kids to write short answers to their questions. There was a stronger relationship between classroom observations and that outcome. Now, we could come back and talk about that, because I think it does have implications for the way we measure student achievement gains in literacy. But even in ELA, there was, using the existing state ELA test, there was a relationship. So it's just not true that value added is completely unrelated to our views of excellent instruction. Okay, what would be a fourth thing you'd want to argue if you were going to argue for the case that student achievement gains should have no weight? Well, you'd say achievement gains on the current tests are completely unrelated to the Common Core. Not to say it's distinct from the Common Core. That's true, but to say that value added provides no information about how well a teacher's students will do on the Common Core tests, so to say that value added on the current test should not be used at all because we should put zero weight on them because we're about to move to the new test, you'd have to be able to say they tell you nothing about how the kids are going to do on the Common Core tests. Well, that is a testable hypothesis. So New York recently moved to a more Common Core aligned state test. We can calculate teachers' value added in 3 different years: in the 2010-11 school year, old test; 2011-12 school year, old test. That's a typo. It's 12-13 in the new test. So in this last year, and we could just say, okay, what was the correlation at the teacher level in value added scores between 10-11 and 11-12 when it was the old test? Correlation was about 0.51. Well, it's not zero. I would argue to argue that it should have zero weight, you'd have to argue that there's absolutely no relationship there. And that's not the case. So I don't think anybody would argue that the weight should be 100%. But again, we're testing the argument that the weight should be zero. And I think this is the right way to think about it. So if there were no relationship, if the value-added scores on the old tests had no predictive power for the new test, we'd expect that correlation backwards to be potentially positive, but forwards to be zero. Well, what was it? It was 0.46, so slightly lower than 0.51, but certainly not zero. So again, if all of this using value-added classroom observations, student surveys, is using imperfect indicators to try to provide feedback to teachers and their supervisors on how well they're doing. All of this is going to be imperfect. To argue that one component should play no role whatsoever, you'd have to argue it provides no information. And again, I just don't see that in any of the data we've looked at. Now, if the goal were to predict value added over a teacher's career on the current state test, what we found in the MET study was that you'd put a huge amount of weight on it. You'd put 75, 80% of the weight on value added if your sole goal were to predict value added in future years. But of course, that's not the only goal of these systems. The goal of these systems is you have to worry about reliability, you have to worry about outcomes that you're not measuring on the state tests, you have to worry about how you're providing feedback to help people improve. And that's why in the Met report we ended up arguing for the 30 to 50% range and not the 80% range weight on these things. Now, just to give you some sense of that, we tried to quantify what some of these trade-offs are. So we said, okay, let's test 4 different models. Let's start with model 1 is the extreme, where your goal is just to predict a teacher's students' outcomes on the state test. What would you do? Well, in that world, you'd put 81% of the weight on value added on the state test. This is in, I think, middle school ELA, these numbers, but you'd see similar results in elementary school and in middle school math. Model 2 says, okay, suppose we backed off that and we said 50% weight on value added, 25 on the other 2, student surveys, classroom observations. Model 3 is a third, a third, a third. Model 4 is going further than, down weighting value added to 33%, going all the way down to 25 and putting 50% of the weight on the observations, which actually is closer to what a lot of states are doing. So we said, what are the implications of those 3 things, or those 4 different weighting schemes with 3 potential outcomes? One is correlation with state test gains. And what you see is, not surprisingly, as you move away from model 1 to the other models that are weighting the classroom observations and the student surveys more, you're lowering the correlation with the state test. You're lowering your ability to predict which teachers will have strong state test gains. But at least initially, you're gaining some other things. So the correlation with these other tests, the tests that require kids to do some writing, does go up a bit, at least initially. But what often happens is if a little bit of something is good, it does not necessarily mean that it's always better to get more of it. So as you downweight the state tests and you start to put more and more weight on the classroom observation, you lose some of the things that you care about. You're actually losing some correlation with these other tests that presumably are measuring skills that we care about. Now, similarly with reliability, so as you move from model 1 to model 2 to model 3, the measures become less volatile. They become more stable from year to year. Why is that? Well, that's primarily being driven by the fact that the student surveys, believe it or not, are among the most reliable of the measures that we tested. Now, at first, that might seem counterintuitive. Like, how could it be that a student's observations or impressions of a class are more consistent from year to year than an observer? Well, an observer, it's easy to imagine that a trained observer would be more discerning than the typical student that's filling out a student survey. But the way you get increased reliability with an adult observation is to average over multiple observers. Well, in the student surveys, you're averaging over 25 kids in an elementary school or 75 or 100 kids per teacher in a middle school. And it's that power of averaging that generates the higher reliability of the surveys. But notice that even when you go from 3 to 4 and you pump up the weight on the observation and you downweight the student achievement gains on the state tests and the student surveys, in that world you actually start to lose the thing that you care about, reliability. So this framework was the one that we used for saying, hey, look, predicting future gains on state tests is not the only thing you care about. There are other things you worry about, correlation with other outcomes, reliability. But it's not obvious that if the goal is those other outcomes as well, that you'd abandon the state test. Quite the opposite. If you go too far in downweighting the state test, you lose some of those other things that you care about.
So we're going to end up in as Doug sort of said and as Tom sort of said, in some ways in a similar place, arguing for some middle ground between 0 and 100 or nothing and something, but we're going to get there in very different ways, looking at the issues from different perspectives. And so I'm asking the broader question here, how do we assess the value added by teaching? And I'm taking it for a moment out of the question of how do you use a specific value-added metric, but I'm going to put it back into that question in just a moment. Go ahead to the next slide. Oh, I guess I can do that because I have this little guy here. Okay, so let's all start with the framework that value-added methods have been a huge boon to educational research. Tom, Doug, and I have all done large-scale studies where you look at how you can measure progress rather than just the status in tests. That's been a problem under No Child Left Behind. You know, just what the basic score is, not where did kids start. We've all had experience researching the effects of practices and programs in these large-scale data sets. And in fact, the MET study that Tom was talking about is one such kind of study where you can look at, in a large-scale way, how various things influence student gains. Doug did some really interesting work with the effects of national board certification, for example, as a practice or a program that you could evaluate in those terms. At the individual level, value-added methods do become more challenging and have difficulties that cause the debate that we're having right now. It's hard to disentangle other influences on student learning. It's hard to measure gains, especially on state tests, and I'm going to come back to that point because there are tests that are better able to measure gain than the current state tests we have. And it's hard to attribute gains to individual teachers. And if you kind of think of the image that would be perfect for 100% use of value added, for example, if we go to that far end of the continuum, it would be a lone teacher working alone behind a closed door who has a major or perhaps the only influence on student learning in an average class that enters with everyone sort of at the beginning of the year in their grade level achievement, and the task is to see how far they get towards the achievement we hope for at the end of the year. Do they get from, the beginning of grade 8 to the end of grade 8, using a perfect test, which measures all that we care about, measures it well, and measures it for all students across the continuum. That would be the context within which the intuitively valuable idea of value added could also translate over to making personnel decisions about individual teachers. And in that context, whereas in the large-scale studies, correlations are very meaningful, in an individual personnel decision, the fact that you have a correlation of 0.5, which means that that variable explains 25% of the variance in something else and doesn't explain the other 75%, is not very reassuring to an individual who's going to be measured by that particular metric. The correlation is only telling you a general tendency. In statistics classes, we always start by, with the height and weight comparison. Height is actually a pretty good predictor of weight. It's about a 0.5 correlation. So if we really want to predict weight, maybe we should try to influence height or measure height as a way to know whether people are obese or fit. But you could say, well, are there better measures like body mass index, like getting on a scale, like physical fitness tests that actually tell you more about weight than measuring height? And so I'm not saying that that's the case with value added, but I am saying that the correlations only get us so far. Teacher effectiveness in context, we have a lot of studies now that have accrued over these last 5 or so years. We find that teachers' value-added effectiveness is influenced by a lot of other things. Their collaboration with peers actually turns out to be a very important influence. Class size in certain contexts, particularly early grades and with higher need students, the curriculum that gets chosen by the school, the amount of time with students. In fact, teachers who loop with students have stronger achievement gains than those who see them for only a semester. Tutoring has a huge effect. Supplementary education services, therefore, can make a big difference. Out-of-school learning, summer learning loss for low-income students has an enormous effect on that spring-to-spring test score gain or how far they may have fallen backwards before they started in the fall. School organization decisions of many kinds and administrative decisions have effects. Student characteristics and attendance have very large effects, especially attendance. And of course, we know that the measure of achievement used can make a difference. And in fact, Tom gave some slides that showed how you get a different value-added metric on the SAT-9 versus the state test. And for individual teachers, that can be it could be quite different. And the statistical model used. So all these things make a difference in the value-added metric. In addition, many things influence achievement gains. This is from a study by Dan Goldhaber and colleagues. These proportions have been looked at in many other studies. This is actually not unlike a study that Rick Hanushek did in terms of finding that, in this case, they were controlling for prior achievement, but the teacher factor is about 8.5% of the prediction of the influence on student achievement. Classroom level factors, school level factors, there's some part that's unexplained. Student background factors include a lot, including the prior test score. But interestingly also, 95% of the school, classroom, and teacher effects were unobservable. What that means is that while we know that those levels in a nested model have some influence, we don't actually know what causes those effects for each of those levels. And when you do value-added models, you're trying to predict what the outcome will be based on some variables on the front end. And some people have done a very sophisticated job of putting a lot of variables into the model. But even so, there are a lot of things that you can't explain. And that metric that is called the teacher effect is what one of my colleagues called the error term in the regression equation. It's basically what you can't explain with the variables you've put into the model. It's whatever's left. And some part of that is the teacher, but some part of it is these other things that are not observed in the model. Because of a variety of factors, the value-added estimates are pretty unstable from year to year. In Tom's earlier slide, when he was showing you some relationships, he was actually using a career average rather than a year-to-year variation. The year-to-year variations, this is from a 5-district study by Tim Sass, boiled down. If you look at a teacher who got an A in year 1, that is top 20%, her chance of getting a C, D, or F is a 50% chance in year 2. A teacher who got an F in year 1, bottom 20%, has a 50% chance of getting an A, B, or C in year 2. Some of us have looked at the question of what causes that variability, because if you just look at what's happening, it bounces around a lot. And in a study I did with colleagues at Stanford, we found this high variability in student achievement. We were looking to identify effective and ineffective teachers, and then we were going to study them and say, oh, the effective teachers did this, the ineffective teachers did that. And in fact, it turns around, people bounce around more at the tails than they do in the middle. And we had this kind of instability. And then we found that actually classroom composition, even though we had controlled for various background characteristics of students, special ed status, English learner status, poverty, and so on, that actually had a lot to do with how those things bounced around. Tracking makes a difference. Which track you're teaching and whether it's tracked. In fact, Doug has done some studies that reaffirm that. For all these reasons, the National Research Council and others have issued reports suggesting that value-added estimates should not be used to make operational decisions because they are far too unstable to be considered fair or reliable. But that's not to say that there's no rationale or logic conceptually for including student learning growth and gains in our consideration of who effective teachers are, because it makes sense that we know that some teachers enable kids to grow and gain more. But there are questions about how you get that information in a productive way. And I think Doug's suggestions about how you may look for signaling of various kinds and screening may help us think about how to use it. Here's a case where teachers measured effectiveness from that study varied quite widely. In year 1, she was in the bottom decile. In year 2, she was in the top decile of effectiveness. We said, oh, we definitely want to study her as ineffective. And then we got the next data and we said, oh, we would definitely want to study her as effective. And then we said, wait a minute, it's the same person teaching in the same high school, the same course, not a beginning teacher with all these controls. But in year 1, 60% of her kids were English learners. In year 2, 5% were English learners. And that change in the classroom composition had a lot to do with what happened. Here's the real kicker. The federal government, in No Child Left Behind, put a law in place that prevented the use of tests like the SAT-9 for state accountability. That law says that you can only measure the grade level. Our tests are only grade level measures. So if you have grade level tests, can they measure growth for students? And in fact, that's not going to change with the new tests under Park and Smarter Balance because the law has not changed. So you've got your tested content, which is a small amount of the total curriculum in that grade level. So there's that, but it also means it's not measuring where the kids are anywhere else along the continuum. Now, if all your kids pretty much fall in that band, you will get some assessment. But here's a school that I work with, happen to have this data in my computer, entering 9th graders, reading scores, fewer than 10% of the kids were reading on grade level. 90% were reading anywhere between kindergarten and 12th grade. So the only kids who could be measured on the grade level standards tests in terms of their gains are those that are circled in that one place. And that creates the problem for English language learners, for example, who are new, but also for kids who are at the top. In New York City, Carolyn Abbott was identified as the worst 8th grade math teacher based on value-added measures. Carolyn taught a 7th and 8th grade class. In 7th grade, she had them scoring at the 98th percentile on this New York State test. So right up at the top, very little gain to be had, right? And here's what the parents and kids said about her. She's a great teacher, she's fabulous, one of my daughter's favorites, an amazing teacher. I've been looking forward to having math with her. What happened? By 8th grade, her kids had very little place to grow on the 8th grade test, but her kids were taking the 10th grade curriculum. And they all passed the Regents 10th grade test in math, a third of them with perfect scores. This teacher, under the rules in New York City, could not be granted tenure at that time, because on that single measure of value added, her gains couldn't be shown. In her case, the grade level test didn't measure really any of what her kids were doing. And so there was no real measure provided by that metric. We find this kind of thing that's happened from Houston on both ends of the continuum. Teachers teaching in grades in which English language learners are transitioned, least likely to show added value, special ed students, but also those teaching gifted students who are way above the grade level also can't show gains. So there are classes of teachers for whom the metric is not accurate. And if you are dealing in individual personnel decisions rather than correlations, it matters whether it's accurate for every teacher. It can also create counterproductive incentives. Here's what some Houston teachers said. I'm scared to teach in the 4th grade. In an ELL transition grade level, that's when the English learners come into the mainstream classes, because my scores are going to drop and I'm going to get fired. And hundreds of teachers have been fired in Houston based on this metric. Another teacher, when they say nobody wants to do 4th grade, nobody wants to do 4th grade, nobody. So we also know that some of our current tests are narrow, and that's been the point that's been made earlier. Here's the solution I would propose. We should use multiple measures of learning to assess student learning. We should not rely simply on the state test, which is restricted in the way that it is. We should have a basket of evidence that teachers develop around goal setting matched to the curriculum and the students that they teach, which can include local, state, and national tests and assessments. and can include authentic assessments of various kinds, essays, research projects, investigations, and so on. Can include English proficiency gains for English learners, accomplishment of learner goals, and other measures. So in Maria's case, her basket of evidence might include the English language proficiency test gains for her new English learners in that class. They might include the developmental reading assessment, which is a profile that allows you to evaluate reading gains across a continuum from kindergarten all the way to 12th grade. They might include the state test, but they ought to be a big asterisk on that because it's a very poor measure for what she's teaching and who her kids are. In Carolyn's case, her basket of evidence should have included the Regents test scores, which were really what her kids were studying, and maybe she would give a pre-test in the beginning of the year about their knowledge of that curriculum so that you could see what their gains were by the end of the year. They might include the state test with a big asterisk on it because it doesn't really measure her kids around the curriculum they were learning. But they could also include the math exhibition that they did at the end of the year where the kids were doing an investigatory project applying their math knowledge. So we need to get to a place where the use of these measures is really productive for student learning and teacher learning. In an integrated system where we don't have a metric on the side, a value-added number over here, which may or may not be accurate, but where you have standards-based measures of practice linked to what's going on with your measures of student learning and professional contributions. In a book I just finished called Getting Teacher Evaluation Right, I give a lot of examples of districts that have done this, where teachers are in fact using goal setting around standards, sometimes individually, sometimes in teams and groups, sometimes in departments, where they're coached by a mentor or a principal around both what they're doing in the classroom and what the evidence of student learning is showing and how those relate to one another, and where sometimes this is being used to produce department-wide and team-wide changes in practice as well as individual changes in practice. Student learning objectives are one way to do that in a goal-setting process that can be individual or collective. They can use a wide range of measures, including state, national, district tests of various kinds. And they can also support collaboration when they're used in the right way. We should also, and I'm closing here, remember that if we want effectiveness at the end of the day, then we should think about all the things that make teachers effective, evaluation being only one. And if we look at the literature on what counts, we should be worrying then about high-quality preparation and mentoring, putting teachers in the right assignments and conditions that allow them to be effective, allowing them to have those collegial learning opportunities that boost collective effectiveness as well as individual effectiveness, having a coherent curriculum that allows kids to make greater gains, as well as evaluation systems that have all of these different components.
Presentations, I have a bunch of other questions, but I'm going to ask the two questions that the panel was prepared for. I just think that's fair.
I didn't look at my
Oh, okay. Okay. I suspect you are really prepared regardless. So, in your packet, I do think if we have a chance, I will ask the second question in a different kind of way, but maybe I'll figure out how to do it as part of the first question. Recently, E.D. Hirsch wrote in a HuffPost piece, or concluded in a HuffPost piece, and I suspect many of you have seen it or was in your packet, right? Maybe it was only in my packet. But in this HuffPost piece, what he concluded was that the value-added measures based on ELA exams of reading comprehension were quite volatile and unstable, as Linda has just said. His conclusion was because the exams necessarily tested not just what a child learned in that particular year, assuming the tests were reliable for that purpose, but they also tested or presumed a student's background. So he actually added, in a different way, a factor that Linda was talking about in terms of equity, but saying it differently. So his conclusion was that they just shouldn't be used in teacher evaluations. And so he got to the conclusion that it should have, 0% weight in terms of teacher evaluations. But I think the question I'm really trying to ask here is that not simply do you agree or disagree with what Hirsch has said. I mean, I think we can predict what the answers would be around the table. But I think what it actually raises is, in some ways, the sharp contrast here between using this data in an aggregate way versus using it individually. And I think that's really where Hirsch was going, and where the panel was, where you see a difference in terms of the panel. That regardless of what this data may say in an aggregate about either a school or a school system, the question really becomes, is it reliable or accurate enough, given everything that's going on, to use it individually and to be consequential individually?
So I think, to boil it down, I think he's kind of wrong on a lot of the details, but possibly has a legitimate point to make about high-stakes testing. I don't even think his point is as much about teacher value added is it about high-stakes testing per se. Because a lot of the arguments he's making would also apply to what we were doing 5 years ago, before Race to the Top and all this came in. It would apply to No Child Left Behind. That, it's not like teachers weren't teaching to the test before the value-added measures came into being. So, in that respect, I think the argument is a little bit different than, the argument I think he's really trying to make is different than the one he sort of stated. On the point about reading being different and families playing a bigger role in reading, I think that's probably right, but I think he's also missing the point that part of the point of value added and the way in which we approach it is to try to take into account some of those factors, not just by measuring family background in some ways, but also by taking into account prior achievement. That's really the most important thing we do to account for the background of the student. So I think he's new to this debate about value added, and I think there are probably a lot of things in the details that I would disagree with him on. But even though a lot of the larger criticisms are valid, and I think we do need to be really concerned, as I think I highlighted in my slides, this problem of teaching to the test and rapidly expanding testing to all grades and subjects and things like that I think are really bad approaches.
So I actually 100% agree with the idea that particularly in literacy, we need to improve the assessments. I think that's one of the findings from the Met study, was that the assessment that is based on what the current state ELA tests are now, which is a kids read a short reading passage and then answer some multiple choice questions of reading comprehension, are not as correlated with other measures of instructional excellence, like a classroom observation, as assessments that require kids to do some writing. Now, I was reading E.D. Hirsch's commentary really carefully, and I'm not sure, though, he would agree that it's good enough to try to include some more writing in the measures of literacy. I think actually his central point is that we should be designing tests that focus on curriculum content, not just general reading ability and writing ability. He's saying, look, if we're going to teach U.S. history, we should have a written test that focuses on the content of U.S. history. If we're going to teach, science, we should have a written test that focuses on the content of science. Now, I think if you did have a measure like that, I read his essay as arguing that that's what we should be holding people accountable for. So ironically, I think one could take his essay and argue for a very different kind of assessment scheme that would be very high stakes. His main point is we don't have that curriculum yet. Now, the question is, we could have a debate about, all right, okay, so we don't have a national curriculum in history. We don't have a national curriculum in social science and sciences. And I'm not sure when and if we ever would have one. That's the core issue in E.D. Hirsch's essay. But I think around the point of, are the current state ELA tests optimal? I think no. Could they be improved? I think yes. E.D. Hirsch might disagree with that. But as I said before, I don't think that there's evidence to argue that therefore we should attach zero weight to the gains on the state ELA test, because those are related to teachers' future gains on those state ELA tests. They are related to what we say is excellent instruction based on classroom observations. Yes, they should be improved, but arguing that they should have no weight, I don't think that, I disagree with, and in fact, I don't think there is the evidence to support that.
So I'd like to just make a couple of points. First, on the general point that Tom was making earlier about the nature of the tests, and then I want to say something about E.D. Hirsch's take on this. We have two problems, or three, around the nature of the tests, maybe more than those, but that are innumerable. Tests like the SAT 9 that Tom was just talking about and that we saw some statistics about are preferable in a couple of ways, although they don't reach the problem that E.D. Hirsch is talking about. One is that they do require some writing and some thinking and a little bit more analysis, and we do see that teachers who do well on state accountability tests are not always the same as those who show higher value added on tests like the SAT 9. Dallas has done that analysis in their value added work for years. The other thing about the SAT 9, and I miss it, frankly, not that I was ever in love with it when we used it in California, but it actually measures on a vertical scale across multiple grade levels. So the level of value-added growth that a teacher might produce or that occurs for a student, regardless of how many teachers are involved in producing it or how many other factors, can be displayed much more accurately and fully than in any grade level test, which says it will only measure the standards at that grade level. And one of the issues that is on the table is that we have a federal policy that, because it was made by people who did not understand assessment or learning or teaching, requires only grade level testing and state tests, and now a policy that was made by people who also fail to understand those factors must be used to measure value-added gains for teachers when it cannot be so used. And so there's a federal policy change that has to be made if we actually want to get closer to being able to look at value-added gains on any continuum, because we're now putting almost all the weight, not on value-added measures, plural, with multiple opportunities for measuring what kids learn, but on a single measure that is probably the most limited measure we could have. But that's actually not the point E.D. Hirsch was making. He was making the point that reading is actually a function of understanding content. Social studies, history, science, the arts, all of the content that we learn. And that we really need to be teaching that content and making it possible for kids to acquire it. And one of the other counterproductive effects of focusing in only on reading and math scores in the NCLB era was that we actually reduced the amount of science we were teaching in schools, the amount of history and social studies, making it harder for kids who rely primarily on school to get access to that knowledge, to get the base on which reading comprehension depends, because reading comprehension is actually a content-rich activity. So he makes the point that in the test prep time that is being generated by current policies is time in which teachers should calmly be pursuing real education, teaching students fascinating subjects in literature, history, civics, science, and the arts, the general knowledge that is the true foundation of reading comprehension. And he's very nice. He says, the villains in this story are not the well-meaning economists who developed the value-added idea, but the inadequate theories of reading comprehension that have dominated the schools and, for that matter, the tests. So I think that's another aspect of why, while we're trying to get a hold of this idea that teaching really does matter for learning, and we want to understand how it matters, that we have to broaden the set of measures that we use and get a basket of evidence that allows us to support the kind of learning that kids need and the more accurate measures that are useful for guiding teaching.
So that leads me to the second question, which the piece of the first question that I don't think any of you answered, then I'm going to just ask the audience if they want the answer. I'll ask you if you want to re-ask the question, which is this notion of the aggregate use of this data versus individual use of that data. And I think that that is a question that really kind of came from a lot of the different presentations. That's really the sharp difference between a lot of the different presentations. But I'm just going to keep it out there to see if others are interested in that. I think that this notion, though, that both Tom and Linda raised at the end of their answer about does teaching matter, raises my second, goes to my second question, which is, if we assume that teaching does matter, then, and that teaching of the Common Core, let me ask it this way, if we assume that teaching does matter, and that the Common Core standards are some template for what kids need to know and be able to do in the 21st century, at least, regardless of whether one thinks that they were prodded or promoted by Race to the Top, 45 states still have adopted them, whether or not they are funding them or whether or not other things are happening, they still have adopted them. But if we think that's really, really, really important, let me ask you if you agree with the call I made about a moratorium on the consequences of high-stakes testing, and whether that moratorium would be beneficial to actually doing the kind of preparation that we think is actually needed to implement the Common Core with fidelity. And whether or not it's the moratorium, the more important question is, do we need to have a real transition that actually is much more about what we're doing in classrooms right now and less about what is being tested? And so whether it's the moratorium idea that we raised in the end of April, or whether, for example, it's the new idea that is emanating out of California that was passed by the California legislature, I think the Senate just last night, and that the governor has said that he will sign, and that Arnie Duncan has said that he will deny, about essentially having a year of a piloting of the Smarter Balance test without revealing any of the results, so that it's really the kind of piloting of the whole process and at the same time not having the old tests. So the bottom line question is, do you agree that there should really be a transitional period of time or not that is decoupled from either the high-stakes consequences of the tests or the testing itself to enable Common Core to be implemented?
So I think it's, on technical grounds, I think it's hard to answer that question. So I think it's substantial. In some ways, I think it's a political question, but let me explain why I think it's hard to answer on technical grounds. So the first point is that the tests are not the same every year anyway, right? Even when we're not changing the testing regime. So what's different about the Common Core is that you're changing the test and you're changing the curriculum at the same time. So it's a much more major change than most states would typically make. But I think we don't know a lot, and I think part of what Tom's presentation earlier was trying to get at is what happens to the properties of value-added measures once you change the test. And I think what it's suggesting, although that was the first I've seen of that, is that it doesn't change the patterns very much. But it is almost certain to change what the results would be for particular teachers, right? So teacher who, if they had kept the test a certain way, kept it the way it is without the switch, would be rated differently. And most teachers will be rated differently, and some perhaps substantially differently. Part of it will depend on how the school implements the curriculum, how much the school's already shifted, because some states and some districts have already made a pretty full shift, and some haven't even tried. So the teachers in districts that haven't even begun that shift are going to be at a pretty big disadvantage. And just one example of how that's going to vary, how it influences teachers will vary across places. So I think whether it's going to be any more or less accurate is hard to say. There are ways in which it could become more accurate. If it's a better test in states where the current test is not a very good one, then in some ways it could end up being, the value-added measures could get better. But I think overall, obviously it's a transition period, and there's more of a political element here. Do we want to kind of recognize the fears of teachers and focus on the implementation of Common Core and get that right first before we worry about the test-based accountability? The flip side is going to be, for those who want to keep the accountability, as well, is this just a slippery slope, and is this just going to mean that maybe we'll never go back to where we were, and this is just sort of a first step towards that? So I think a lot of it comes down to these partly political decisions and partly issues of more around implementation of Common Core than it is about whether it's valid to use teacher value-added measures when we've made a shift like this.
So I think we could have a reasonable discussion of whether or not it makes sense to have a moratorium on the high stakes on the value-added scores during a transition year. But I just wanted to clarify, that's not what's happening in California. What's happening in California is particularly irrational and absurd, I'll have to say. It's not put this way, but this is what it is. It is, we're going to test 3.3 million children in California and not score it.
Is it not scored or not share the scores?
It's not score most of them. They're going to score a subset of the pilot. Now, if I were, what is the argument for that, as opposed to just saying, look, we're not going to test it all in spring of 2014? If the argument, so here's an argument for a moratorium that I think makes sense, that says, hey, look, we're shifting to new standards. We need to help teachers figure out how to teach to these new standards. So if we have a year in which the tests are not used for high stakes, that might ease that transition. I don't see how we're going to help teachers teach these new standards if we don't tell them how their kids did. I don't see how, in any way, that could prove to be useful. If we're not even going to tell them, after they've spent a year trying to teach the new standards, whether or not their children have achieved the standards or not. That seems particularly irrational. So now, the evidence I reported before was that actually, honestly, was a bit of a surprise to me. I would have thought, based on what we found in MET, that when New York State moved from their old test to a test that was more aligned with the Common Core, I would have expected that correlation, which I showed went from 0.51 to 0.46, I would have predicted it would have gone down more. I would have predicted it would have gone down from 0.51 to 0.3 or 0.25. I'd still argue that that the old tests still provide information, but I would have predicted in that year it wouldn't have been as much. Now, just to clarify what Doug's point earlier was that okay, when we move from one test to another, you'd expect a teacher's results to change. What I reported says, okay, yes, lots of people's results changed, but no more than usually did even when they kept the same test. So the correlation was about the same, 0.51 to 0.46. So things changed. Yes, the measures are not perfect. But again, so remember, here's one piece of this argument that I think many people forget. They sort of think in the back of their minds that there is such a thing as a no-stakes decision. That somehow, if the evidence isn't perfect, we should hold. But there is, in certain kinds of decisions, there is no such thing as a low-stakes decision. So under most collective bargaining agreements, after 2 years, a teacher gets tenure the third year. A principal is making a decision not about one teacher. A principal is making a decision about 2 teachers. There are 2 teachers involved in every tenure decision. One is the teacher that has been there in that school for 2 years. The other is the potential other novice teacher who would love to have that job. And we are asking supervisors to make a hard decision involving 2 different teachers. The teacher that they know, whose birthday party they've been to, and maybe whose children's pictures they've seen, and the teacher that they maybe have never met before. And to argue that if somebody has a poor track record, that somehow we should deny that slot to the young teacher who's applied for that job, I think is pretending that there is such a thing as a no-stakes decision, and is ignoring the costs borne by the students and borne by the teacher who's being overlooked.
Tom, I don't think that was, before Linda goes, with all due respect, I don't think that was the question. I think the real issue becomes not whether there should be teacher evaluations and whether that should be, and the stakes associated with that. I think the real question becomes, just in this transitional period of time, the issue about the moratorium, that's number one.
Right.
And the other real question becomes, is this actually, with a 50% shot of getting it right or getting it wrong, is it actually really a measure of student learning? I think that those are really the questions here. I don't mean to be,
right. I didn't draw I realized I didn't draw the connection clearly enough. What I was saying was, over that threshold, if it turned out that a teacher's student achievement gains on the old tests told you nothing about their student achievement gains on the new tests, I would agree with you that, hey, look, there definitely should be a moratorium. Because what that says is we've got no information based on that old test about how that teacher's students will do following the adoption of the new test. But what we know is actually that's not the case. What we know is that, say if there's that teacher who's up for tenure during that threshold year, do we know anything about how well his or her students will do the year after they get tenure when they switch to the new test? The answer is yes, we do. And I would argue it would be a mistake to throw that information away.
Linda.
I'm trying to decide whether to answer your question or respond to Tom, but I'm going to try to answer your question. I just have to say, though, that the correlations are not the real issue. I mean, when you go from a 0.51 to a 0.46, so in the first case, your score on that first value-added metric predicts 25% of the variance in your score on the second one. It drops to 20% of the variance predicted. That still leaves a huge amount of the variance not predicted, and you don't know which is right. And even when a teacher has a score that correlates from one year to the other, on whatever the metrics are, what we know about the errors in the current system, particularly for teachers teaching kids at the tails of the distribution, is that if you teach gifted classes year after year after year, the AP kids, you're going to have low value added on certain measures, and that's going to correlate from year to year perhaps, but that doesn't mean you're a bad teacher. So we have to keep coming back to the meaning of the scores and not just the correlations, and whether they're modest or, less than modest, and that's really what we're talking about there. With respect to the moratorium question, and that's, by the way, I do think that there are value-added measures that can be helpful to us, but I think we've got to get closer to the ones that are the most meaningful. And that's the conversation I think we should be having, the one that's educational in its substance. With respect to the moratorium, I think it's very sound that we should be getting a moment where people, when countries introduce new curriculum standards, curriculum and tests, as they do in many countries, that we're now trying to emulate with the Common Core, it's a 5 to 7 year period in which they introduce standards, they develop curriculum resources, they do professional development for teachers, they build the assessments to measure those, and so on. And so there should be a process by which we help people learn how to do this work if we want to understand the outcomes of the work that they've been doing. They've been teaching to different standards, they've been teaching to different tests, the curriculum materials have not yet arrived, the professional development is still on the way, and the assessments are being field tested this year. They're not even actually done. They're not supposed to be done until 2014-15. So does it make sense to have a moratorium? I would say absolutely on high stakes. I don't think we should have a moratorium on the assessments because people need to see them and get used to them and learn about them and begin to incorporate that into their practice. But we shouldn't be punishing people, kids or teachers, based on the results of those tests. I would go further. I would say it's time to move from the test and punish accountability schema of No Child Left Behind to an assess and improve schema of a new accountability system. And really, we need to rethink, we're going to pour this new wine, which could be very good wine, and now I'm going into my California space.
What do you call it? Test and punish to improve and what?
And assess and improve. I live close to Napa Valley, so I have to go there. This new wine into old bottles, and it's going to turn sour. When you talk to teachers about the Common Core and they read the Common Core initially, typically they're very excited about the vision of learning, the vision of career and college readiness that's embedded in this. And they think about all the great things they could do in their classroom to measure that. But that excitement often turns to fear and dread because they're fearful that we'll be back in the old test and punish modality, that this is going to be used, there won't be time to get it right, and it'll be used to deny kids promotion to the next grade or diplomas or teachers a fair evaluation, or schools the opportunity to exist and have a multiple measures approach. So I think if we move to a new accountability system where we're doing what other high-achieving countries do, what the Finns call intelligent accountability, which is using the results to evaluate what's working, to set in place, improvements that can make them better, curriculum development, professional development, and so on, where people can really focus on the kind of teaching that Edie Hirsch was talking about. And we can use tests for good rather than being constrained by the misuse of tests. We will be in a much better educational position at the end of this next decade than we are today.
Yes,
Just
absolutely.
clarifying question. So,
And I am actually, the reason I look like I'm being rude here is I'm actually seeing if there's any Twitter, since this is being live streamed, if there's any Twitter questions as including the questions in the audience.
oh, I thought that was you texting me. No.
Yes, I was texting you, love that stuff.
Linda, I'm trying to clarify your position a little bit. Are you saying more that you're in a number 2 position, the way I had described it, that you don't think value-added measures should be used in high-stakes decision, and that the basket is being used more for support and information through a more subjective decision-making process that the principals might use or that a district might use? Or are you saying something more like the number 3 or 4 position, where we're still using it as high stakes, but a more comprehensive set of measures? I'm just not quite sure where it's coming down.
Well, there's several things on the table here. Yeah. One is school accountability, one is teacher accountability, and one is student accountability. And the call for a moratorium, I think, was on all of those. That is, let's not use these tests before we've figured out how to do the teaching for any of those purposes. With respect to the individual teacher evaluation question, which I think you're asking me to return to, I really believe that we need not only whatever these new tests will tell us about students' achievement of the Common Core standards, and I will tell you I'm deeply disappointed that the way that the management of the process has occurred, we will still be stuck in grade level standards, and that's going to really make it hard to say anything about whether kids below grade level are making progress and whether kids above grade level are making progress, which is most kids, by the way. It's not, it's not a minority of the kids. But I do think that they can be helpful once we figure out what they're doing and what they can tell us, supplemented by other measures, which help us get at the things they don't evaluate. So if I were trying to put myself on your 1 to 5 scale, I think I would be arguing for multiple measures which can be used in a value-added sense. And I think there are other measures that are better for value-added.
But used for high-stakes employment decisions, used for tenure, used for compensation,
used
and so
as part of the holistic determination of a teacher's ability to continue their employment or to be tenured or whatever. I actually don't know that it, I don't think any single measure should be used, and as you know, I'm particularly disenchanted with the state test as a psychometric tool in this regard. And if I haven't made that clear, let me say it again. Because there are so many better measures. I mean, if I were an elementary school principal, I'd say I want to look at the developmental reading assessment, which actually has a scale and measures things more fully and more comprehensively and points teaching in the right direction and gives me a sense of which kids are making progress and which teachers are helping the kids make progress. But I think that the extent to which there will be useful tools for different teachers will vary, as your point suggested also. And I like the idea of diagnostics and screening using more than one measure. And I would say for most teachers, there are 2 or 3 measures that ought to be in a basket that you could look at based on what's appropriate for evaluating the gains they're making with their students.
Okay, let me ask the audience, and then I will actually ask one of the Twitter questions that I've gotten. Yes, and do me a favor, just say your name, right? And turn around so that
Vicki,
people can see you in the
up,
camera.
Up here.
Right here, Vicki. And then one question back there and one question on Twitter.
I'm Jerome Dantas. I'm a retired professor of mathematics from the University of Maryland. And I guess I'm concerned that the teacher evaluations is putting an undue onus on the teachers, and it's completely letting the textbooks off the hook and the administrators off the hook. I'd like to give you a quote from U.S. Secretary Education, Annie Duncan. It's hard to teach what you don't know, and when you get to middle school, we see a lot of students begin to lose interest in math and science. It's because their teachers don't know the math and the science. Well, the obvious, now...
So do me a favor, because we're,
so-
just get to a question.
Well, well, at the end.
Uh,
I'll be quickly.
Because we
But,
are running out
you
of
know,
time.
unfortunately, when he put out the rules for Race to the Top, he didn't say that states that would raise the licensing requirements so that the teachers would actually know the content, that those states would get points. And he didn't say that states which would provide professional development in content so that those who don't know the content would then know the content, that those states would get points. And so I'm suggesting that the teacher evaluation is a distraction from having professional development and licensing so that all the teachers will know the content and not just many of them. And do you agree? Question, do you
I
agree?
would just say the Finns would agree with you, because that's what they focus on.
Okay, next question. Back there. And then I'm going to ask one of these questions from Laura Coscarelli.
David Cohen from the Department for Professional Employees, AFL-CIO. Professor Darling-Hammond's holistic integrated approach struck me as hauntingly rational, which is anything that strikes me that way seems to me likely to be doomed from the start. But I would like to ask the other two panelists what problems or objections you see in that holistic integrated approach.
So thanks for asking that, because the funny thing is I often get cast in these kinds of panels as the value-added proponent, where I spent 4 years...
No, the VAG, the value-added guy.
Yeah. Where I spent 4 years of my life trying to improve the other components of a teacher evaluation system. So I spent 4 years going around saying, okay, we've got to make the classroom observations higher quality. Let's test out the measures that we've got. I said, well, gosh, like, are there other things we could do, like student surveys, and would that be informative? And all of the discussions that we've had up here about the downsides to the value-added measures apply equally, and in some cases, even more strongly, to the other components of the holistic review, which I support, by the way. So when I said 30 to 50% on achievement gains, I was saying everything else has got to be these other things, but let's make sure they're high quality. I'm most worried, by the way, about the quality of the classroom observations that are being done right now. Not that it's not that I don't think that there are problems, there are issues to be resolved with value added, but I'm even more worried about the classroom observation, which we haven't talked about. And we've got a project going where we're trying to make the classroom observation higher quality and more valuable for teachers. We call it the Best Foot Forward project. There's so many potential advantages to video for an observation, not the least of which is if you're going to sit down and have a holistic conversation with a teacher, reading from your notes from a classroom observation is not going to be the most powerful thing, because for a teacher who's struggling, it's that they haven't noticed something in the class. They haven't noticed that there were some students that got turned off when they responded a certain way to a question. They didn't notice that there were some students in the back of the class absolutely paying no attention. And you cannot get somebody to notice something that they didn't notice by reading your notes. The only way you get somebody to notice something they didn't notice at the time was to show them a video of it. So what we're trying, but I'm not arguing that we stick a video camera in classrooms. What instead, with this Best Foot Forward project idea is, we give teachers the camera. We say, when you have 4 lessons, here are our standards. When you have 4 lessons that you're particularly proud of, you submit them, and we'll train your principal to have a meaningful feedback conversation. I actually think that that would be a dramatic improvement on the quality of classroom observations, but we're going to see whether that's the case, whether by doing that you actually have principals more satisfied, teachers more satisfied, and better student achievement gains. So I totally agree that the holistic approach is the way to go. I think we're underestimating, though, how hard it's going to be to get those other components of the portfolio done well. And I think we're spending too much time worried about the downsides to the value added, which are real, but also apply to all these other parts, which, and maybe even more importantly.
I just want to agree with Tom on that because, and acknowledge how much of the work that the Med Project did on observations and student surveys is going to be extremely useful. And I think part of our debate has been, well, how do you put them together and weight them? And I've articulated a view that in the student learning component, there ought to be more than one measure of student learning, whatever that size of that component is, and it ought to be looked at in relation to your teaching. Because the other thing is that if I'm a history teacher and I'm causing the kids to write and do revisions of their research papers, the English teacher may get the credit for that if it's not if what happens on the English test doesn't get linked back to the teaching, right? So there's that piece. But the key is then when you do flag, hopefully with multiple measures, a concern or a problem, hopefully with more valid multiple measures, then there should not be a mechanical decision about who can get tenure or who will be dismissed. And that's happened in districts that have just said, we've got this one metric, and usually it's this value-added metric, and that by itself can be the trigger. At that point where you have a concern about a teacher that's reified through these hopefully increasingly valid measures, then you need a process by which, an analysis goes on, feedback gets given, a peer assistance and review program gets put in place where a mentor works with you and you have the chance to improve, and where a serious judgment is made based on that combination of measures that have been vetted and worked with. And I think part of the challenge right now is to move states and districts past what has started in many cases to be a mechanical way of looking at teacher evaluation, sometimes with a metric that is not suitable in all cases, to a way that is more grounded in reliable evidence of various kinds and managed in a professional fashion. And I think Tom and I agree about that.
I'm going to let Doug quickly, and then I'm going to ask the Twitter question.
So I think there's an important distinction to make here, which is the difference between mechanical and multidimensional or multiple measures. Right? You can have and what I'm proposing really in the screening process is something that's mechanical, but that's a little bit more complicated and certainly involves multiple measures. I think the question that I'm not sure how, Linda, how the basket idea fits into this is whether it's just give the information to the principal or the district people and let them make these decisions however they see fit, and how much of it is we're still going to have a very specific concrete process for using the measures, and it's still going to be mechanical in the sense that once you've gone through this process, the decision that comes out at the end is the decision and not subject to more subjective decisions. I think that's the fundamental possible difference here.
So some states, for example, in doing Race to the Top, and I would take Massachusetts as an example, put a matrix approach in place where they said you must use multiple measures of student learning. And if they all point in a negative direction, you're going to be in this part of the matrix, which is going to give you a flag, right? Or if most of them are uninspiring, and some of them are, obviously at the bottom. But the goal was that within they're classifying, but by using several measures, and then there's a process, and the process then goes into a peer review and an analysis and a process by which at the end of a year, if there is an improvement, then you have a personnel decision. I'm not arguing against personnel decisions. In fact, I'm a very strong believer that you've got to have productive ways to identify teachers who are not succeeding, and then help them improve and remove them if they don't improve. And I've seen lots of ways that that can work. I am concerned that some of the metrics we could use would be inaccurate. And that's completely debilitating to teachers like Maria or Carolyn or others who are not anomalies. We know that they exist, and we know what some of the reasons are for the anomalies that the metrics produce.
I think just one quick, I promise quick. I think the concern is that there might still, if in this process there's a point at which it becomes almost completely subjective how the decisions get made, we may kind of go back to where we were, 10 years ago, where we weren't really paying attention, where we weren't doing what you just said you think we should do of getting teachers who are really low performing out the door. And I think the question is whether in that process you have a point at which that can happen, and whether we might go back in that direction.
Well, in the districts that were, I'm sorry.
So let me just say, I think the debate here is basically data informing decisions versus data dictating decision. And I think that's really the debate that's, that's emerging in our space. And, I think that both of you, this is the kind of discussion that we're going to be having for a long time. But that's where I think you're starting to see, does these data points get you to a magic decision for which there's not going to be any subjective change, versus do they just inform that decision? And with Doug basically saying, that there's been, sorry to put words in your mouth, such a distrust of the educators writ large that people have looked at needing to have this data because of that distrust. Let me do the one last question, which was on Twitter, because we are in the 21st century, from Laura Cascarelli, who asked the panel, what is the role of teacher preparation institutions in preparing teaching candidates to be evaluated by value-add measures?
I have an idea.
I thought you would.
We'll let Tom start.
I think, so we know from lots of research that teaching ability is not fixed. It is changeable. It does improve. In fact, we do know that clinical experience matters a lot. How do we know that? Well, we know it because when you look at the value-added student achievement gain measures, and I'm sure it would be true of the other measures as well, but it's been less studied, is that there's improvement from the first to the second to the third year of teaching, and it flattens out. I think the real issue is I don't think we have taken the lessons on the importance of clinical experience and applied it backwards to how we're training teachers and teacher training institutions. And I think if we did, we would see better student outcomes for first-year teachers. Rather than, teaching them the history of education, we ought to be teaching them how to teach.
Well, and indeed, we agree on that, and I think there's some evidence that in places that are doing deep clinical training, teachers who are first-year teachers start at the level that third-year teachers used to start at, and we have some value-added evidence about that. One of the things that will actually improve the quality of learning for kids in the long run is if teachers themselves know how to develop student learning evidence in their classroom and use it to inform their ongoing instruction. So what teacher education institutions should be doing is helping beginning teachers learn about how to measure their, learning in a variety of ways, authentic and rich ways, not just, kind of multiple choice strategies, and look at growth from one unit to the next, from one assessment to the next, and inform their own teaching around that. And so there are places that are doing that, and there are others that need to do more of it. There is a new assessment that we've worked on in California that was based on the National Board for Professional Teaching Standards portfolio, where you do have to track student learning gains for students in the portfolio. And it requires, as part of licensing, that you have to plan a curriculum, teach it, be videotaped, and measure student learning for that curriculum in that unit. And that's all scored, but the teachers have to learn in the course of doing it how to look at, how to structure assessments and evaluate student learning. And if they learn that, and if we have a process in schools that is not just metrics produced from outside, but also metrics produced from inside the classroom about student learning, what will happen is we won't have teachers who are saying, I teach the same notes I taught every class period for the last 20 years, but they're saying, what did my kids learn? How do I adjust my instruction? How do I enable more of them to learn more effectively? And I think we can get a lot of traction on that in pre-service.
You got the last word, Doug, if you want.
So, yeah, and I'll say a little bit. I'm not sure that we've given, that the value-added debate itself has produced a lot of useful evidence yet for schools of education. I think we're building towards that, being able to provide more concrete advice about the specific things that are associated with value-added. I think there is a concern about this movement towards evaluating the schools of education with value-added, which hasn't really come up just yet, which is also happening. I think, especially, some schools just don't attract the strongest, academically strongest students, right? And so, one thing that seems to show up in the literature, it's not a really tight relationship, but that people who have stronger academic skills are going to be better teachers on the average. So I think part of the concern is thinking about what it is we're evaluating the schools of education on. Are we evaluating them on who they attract and who they're able to recruit and get into these programs, which we might want to evaluate them on, right? We might want to make that part of what they have to do. Or are we evaluating them how much kind of value they add literally to the students they're able to attract? So I think there's a lot involved in that. I think that debate's going to be ongoing. But I think as researchers, we also have to be providing some more guidance to them about what they should be doing. And I think a lot of the suggestions that have been made are things we probably knew before the value-added debate. It was not like we learned that recently, that we should be teaching teachers how to teach and be focusing on instruction and classroom management and things like this.
So I want to thank the panel for a really wonderful presentation and an even more wonderful discussion after the presentation. And I want to thank everyone for coming and participating in it. And this ends our panel today.
Randi,
Leo.
if I could add.
Sorry.
That's okay. I just wanted to add one last thank you. Randi gave credit to the staff of the Shanker Institute, but all the staff would tell you that in truth, there's one person, Vicki Thomas, who was at the office till 8 o'clock last night, who made sure this all happened.
Thank you very much, everybody.